Hi, it's Lisa. I'm here with my friend Tai today, and she's an accomplished leader and consultant in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy. She believes that no one should have to leave who they fully are at the door when they arrive at work. And, I couldn't agree more. And so I'm really excited for this conversation and to share it with you all. Thank you so much for being here, Tai. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for our conversation today.
Me too. Yay. Okay, can you just give us a little bit of an overview of how you've arrived at this point in your career?
Yes, absolutely. So interestingly enough, I got my degree in college in web development, and somehow from there ended up in staffing and client support, which I think is not an uncommon story, though probably a strange one. But over the past decade or so, I've been working to support clients in their recruiting or also on site, managing consultants and things like that. And being on site and managing consultants is actually where I really found my passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Having so many folks that I had to manage on site and make sure that their needs were being met, et cetera, it presented some very interesting challenges. And then, some additional questions of, hey, why do we do things this way? Or is there a better way that we can make sure that folks feel like they belong here? So from that, I started asking questions at my own company. How do we handle this? What process do we have in place for that? And I was actually able to go through, we had an internal diversity leadership program, and I was able to go through that program, ask those questions, do some networking and some hard work, certainly, but also with some good timing. My organization was creating the diversity and inclusion program manager role. And so the timing really worked out, and I was asking the right questions and things. So I was able to step into this role at the beginning of 2020, sort of before the whole world went haywire. And that's what I've been doing since.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So can you explain for us what DEIB is? And especially, what is so special about the E, the I, and the B? Because we talk a lot about diversity, but I think those other letters, sometimes people get a little bit confused.
We do, and I think you're absolutely right. The diversity bit seems to be the question or the conversation that we continually go back to, and it's an important one. I definitely want to make sure that I say that. It is a very important conversation. But DEIB really, I look at it as a journey. So, you start with diversity. Diversity is a fact of the world. We know that the world is a diverse place. And then sort of the ending of the journey is the inclusion and the belonging. That's the goal of what you're trying to get to. You like your environments to be inclusive of the folks that you have. You want folks to feel like they belong. The equity bit, I really think of as the vehicle that's going to get you to the inclusion and the belonging. So what's interesting is I feel as though we really skip the equity conversation too often. Either that or we confuse it with equality. And those are two different things, right? Two very important things, but two different things. Equity demands that we examine our processes that we have in place, our policies that we have in place. How are we recruiting people and getting them in the door? How are we retaining those people? How are we promoting those people? That's all going to be involved in the equity conversation. So if you really think about DEIB as a journey, to say that I know that the world is an inclusive or a diverse place, and I know that I want my organization or even my friend group or my community, et cetera, to be a place where people feel as though they belong, then the vehicle that's going to get you there is equity. And then you get to inclusion, and then you get to belonging.
Okay. So it's interesting because, as I was thinking about this interview, and I do want to get to the point where we talk about leading individuals, leading employees, because we don't always have power over how our organization does things, or how, what the systems are. So really looking at sort of as leaders, how do we make a workplace that is more inclusive and that sets the stage for belonging. I think about, as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the challenges that a newer leader may face in that, and recalling actually leading a diverse team earlier in my leadership career. And we had a situation that I'd love to tell you about and kind of do a debrief after the fact, long after the fact. But it was because I reflected on it and felt like I just didn't handle it well. And I think I would now have a different perspective on it. But I think, what is the best way? And I'm hesitant to say the right way, because, I know there's not any one right way to handle it. I do think I probably handled it the wrong way. But so the situation was, I was leading a team. One of the teams that I was leading was had a lot of people who were Jewish. And so this was the first year that I was leading this team, and we came upon Yom Kippur. I didn't know what, I'd heard the name, but I didn't know what Yom Kippur was or what the significance of it was. And it was all of a sudden, I was faced with a team of people who were doing really essential work in the community, in healthcare. And I suddenly had all these requests for time off. And I'm sure the previous manager had probably handled it well and knew to expect it and all of this, but I had no idea. And suddenly, like 2/3 of my team is not showing up for work on this day. And so it was, it was a really tough situation. And I wound up, I think, where I say I handled it poorly, I think is just in the way that I spoke with employees about, like, because it kind of threw me, and I was like, well, but we have to, we have to deliver the service and all of that kind of thing. We wound up working it out. But I think it's that inclusion and belonging piece that I probably did really badly. So, I'm wondering, I mean, it's a lot to sort of ask, but, can you help me to figure out, if I could go back and whisper in the ear of my former self, what would I say?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think you hit on a really big piece that I think people overthink. And that is to say, I think that it's a very common, what I'm going to call mistake, for lack of a better word, that leaders of all levels make, whether you're new, whether you've been leading a team for a long time. It doesn't seem to necessarily matter. You get so caught up in the job and the numbers and the deliverables, et cetera, that you don't take the time to really get to know your people. Right? Maybe you hire some new folks on your team, you integrate them. You're so focused on, we need to make sure they know how to do the job. We need to make sure they know how to do the job our way, et cetera. And we miss the networking piece, I think, of working with people. And that is to get to know them. And it's the simplest, smallest idea, but we don't spend enough time, I think, doing that. Mm-hmm. So as a leader, if you want to be an inclusive leader, one of the best ways to get started doing that is to get to know your folks. Ask questions, ask them to tell you what they need, ask them to tell you, what things you can do to support them day in and day out. So in having those conversations where you're saying, hey, listen, I just want to make sure that you feel heard and valued and included, et cetera. Can you let me know, what your experiences have been and how I can, help, or how I can support as a leader? That's where people will tend to start opening up and saying, as in your example, hey, listen, I'm Jewish. We, celebrate, this particular holiday, I may need to take some time off around this time, or observance or celebration. It's not always obviously a happy thing necessarily, but there are things that are observed culturally. And as a leader, you can't know what you don't know, right? And that was your experience. You just weren't aware of this particular cultural event. And that in and of itself is okay. It's okay to not know. But when you got into that position, if you had taken the time to have that conversation, I don't know if you did or didn't, making some assumptions, but having that conversation early in can tend to help avoid some of these issues. And if nothing else, it makes it so that your team knows that you are open to hearing and learning and understanding. So as things come up in the future, they know that you have an open door. In that particular instance, maybe I'm not sure how soon after you started this was, maybe there wasn't enough time, when it's something where you sort of step in it, so to speak, and you're having to kind of recover. I always say apologizing is the first thing. I apologize. I was not aware that this was something that was upcoming. That was my mistake. I will do better in the future. I'm not, and be honest, I'm not sure exactly how we're going to manage this because we have X, Y, and Z deliverable. However, I know that this is important for you to take time to go do. So I'm going to figure this out, between the folks that we have left or talk to leadership, et cetera. There are obviously, like you said, there's not one right way, but to have that conversation to say, I was not aware. Thank you for making me aware. We will figure out how to maintain and manage while you go off and take your well-earned time, well-deserved time. I know I've had a few incidents like that where I sort of step in it. I had this was a contractor that was working with us, and this person is transgender, and there was some sort of an issue with a person that worked at the front desk where they were misgendering this individual, and it happened multiple times. And so when the contractor came to me and said, listen, this person at the front desk keeps misgendering me, it feels like it's on purpose, I am uncomfortable, whatever the concern was, however they voiced it. I was sitting there, and again, I was in it, right? So I didn't have time to think of a strategy. I was in it. And during this conversation, at one point, I asked something along the lines of, did they think that this was malicious, or did they think that maybe it was taking this person a little while to get used to a new habit, right? And the question, however I asked it, because I maybe didn't word it exactly that way, but that was what I was trying to get to. However I asked it upset the contractor. And that's totally fair. That's totally valid, right? I made the mistake. I messed up. And I often think about that because I wonder, to your point, how else should I have handled it? My intent was to get to the bottom of, do I need to escalate this to HR, right, as a larger issue with the person at the front desk? Or is it maybe just someone struggling to get used to, gendering someone correctly, right? And so those are two different things. So I definitely messed that one up. And I still don't know exactly the best way to, have asked that question. But, being humble enough to accept the fact that, hey, I messed that up and I'm going to research. And since then, I've joined Facebook groups. I've, tried to read and learn as much as I can from various resources online, because the next time that I have something like this, hopefully it doesn't happen, but the next time if it does, hopefully I am better prepared to deal with it.
That's so interesting, because when I think about this sort of leads me to another question about microaggressions, and some that are not so micro, but I think microaggressions become so difficult for people to maneuver sometimes. So I'm really curious about that. The other thought that's coming to mind is also, I have a dear loved one who's in the LGBT community. And I remember when he first talked to me about it, I remember saying to him, I want you to know that there are people who are bigoted and there are people who are just ignorant. And so if I deal with this in the wrong way, I want you to know that I'm just ignorant, and I will work to do better and to learn more. And so it allowed us to kind of have the conversation about, like, I might screw up, I might say something wrong, and I just want you to know that this is where it's coming from. So, the idea of microaggressions, is a tough one sometimes, because, when you ask, was it malicious, do you think, right? I think that can be where people struggle sometimes with addressing microaggressions, is because they try to figure out what the person intended. But it's really hard to be in somebody else's head, right?
Yes.
So what do you like? How do you advise people around that?
Yeah, so the prevailing concept in that discussion is intent versus impact. Right. And then so, as I would said in my story, my intent didn't match my impact. Right. And that's often the case. And that's where microaggressions fall. And the reality is, and again, now that I know more, now that I've done some research and learning, the reality is your intention doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And that's a hard concept, I think, especially for folks in Western culture, because, we're used to, there's this great graphic. I wish I had it. There's this great graphic. It's a comic. And in the background, there's a car. And then you see these two people standing in front. One of them is holding their foot. And they're saying, ouch, my foot hurts. And the other person is saying, I'm so sorry I ran over your foot. I didn't mean to. I'm really a good driver. And that's the whole comic. And I love it because it illustrates exactly that. Your intent didn't matter. You still ran over my foot, right? And I appreciate your apology, but my foot still hurts, right? So microaggressions can be really tough because, to your point, you can't know what you don't know. And ignorance is a thing that, all of us are ignorant to something. That said, I think it's more about the way that you recover when you make those missteps, right? So you're going to mess up. I think that's the first thing. People, when we talk about DEIB, one of the first things people say is, oh, I'm so terrified to make a mistake. Stop it. Just stop it. Put that aside, put that down, lean into it. You're going to make mistakes. When you started working, whatever job you're at, you made mistakes because you didn't know everything there was to know about doing that job. This is no different. It's a muscle. You have to exercise it. So moving beyond that fear of making mistakes is really huge. If you commit a microaggression, or if you do something that is offensive and someone says, hey, again, you ran over my foot, it's about how you recover. It's not, oh, I'm sorry that you were offended. I didn't mean to do that. That's not how you recover. You say, Lisa, thank you for pointing that out. I hear that what I did was hurtful to you, and I apologize. I am going to work to do better. It's really that simple. And then you follow up by doing the work to do better.
Right. Okay. That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you. Another place where awareness has really expanded recently is around how bias is built in to some of those go-to things that we use when we're hiring. Things like education, where did you go to school? Was it one of the best schools? What was it? High profile companies that you worked at, so volunteer or community work that you might have had time to do and been able to work in. And some of those things are how we assess good fit, right? Good fit in our organization or in the role. So can you comment a little bit on how bias is built in there? Because we talked about hiring and how is bias built in there? And there's two parts of any kind of behavior change. One is knowing that you're doing the behavior, and the other is, what do you do instead?
Yes. And oof at that question. That's a big question, right? And that's one of the things that everybody's talking about right now. What areas can we take a look at to maybe evolve or adjust in our organization? And really, I think that comes back to the equity piece of the discussion, as I mentioned earlier. Bias, again, is a fact of human nature. We all have it. We are all always going to have it. It's never going away. I don't care how many unconscious bias trainings you take, you're still going to have bias. It's a fact, right? We can, however, in spite of the fact that it's never going away, we can make sure that we are keeping our bias under control by looking at how we interact with each other, again, despite those biases that exist. So in a work setting, right, when we're talking about things like hiring, looking at the processes that you have. I know a lot of organizations will rely and have relied heavily on referral hiring. And that's great because it gets you, ideally it gets you folks who, will again fit the company culture. The downside to that is then you have a very homogenous culture, a group of people typically. Usually it's, we all went to the same college, or we all are into the same sport, or, whatever it is. And so you lose diversity that way. So is referral hiring something that you shouldn't do? Not necessarily, but is it something that you should heavily rely on for your recruiting? I would say no, because you're going to get a homogenous group of people, and that is the antithesis of what we're trying to do in having inclusive and belonging environments. When you're talking about, again, looking at resumes, looking at writing job descriptions, asking the question, do I need someone with a 4-year degree for this entry-level position that I'm hiring for? Is that really a need? Or can I maybe find somebody that, has a high school diploma, or do they need to have a degree at all, right? I mean, and depending on the industry that you're in and what you're doing, that may or may not be the case. There is a reality to the world, right? And that is, if you are working in many corporate environment, really probably almost any corporate environment, you probably want somebody at minimum who's graduated high school. And that's a discussion that, that can be had. But ask that question. What is the true minimum? It's the same with, those job descriptions you see where it says, 7 to 10 years experience required. Well, do they really need that? Or is this mid-level position maybe something that you can hire somebody, again, who maybe that's where you look for somebody who has a 4-year degree, or maybe you only really need somebody with 3 to 5 years experience. It's not about completely removing every checkpoint that exists and letting anybody do anything. It's about asking yourself why those checkpoints are there. Because the reality is they were probably created out of a sense of somebody saying, I need to hire someone, but I don't want to look at 10,000 resumes. So I'm going to try to build this job description in a way that only gets me the people that are going to be the right fit. So then we start creating all of these barriers. And that's not the intent, right? But that's what we're doing. We're building all of these barriers to limit access to who's applying.
Right.
But again, then we're not being equitable. So asking those questions, reviewing those policies, seeing, is it necessary for those barriers to exist? Sometimes the answer is yes, right? You don't want to hire a doctor and say, oh, you just need to have a high school diploma, right? There's a reality to this. But for most of us who are just in corporate America doing sort of, any old job, it's not really necessary. And that's where we have to start examining, are we being equitable? Is it necessary to have some of these barriers that we have? And I highly recommend that organizations take a look at their processes for both hiring as well as promotion and retention, because there's multiple sides to that coin. And if an organization is not comfortable doing that or doesn't really know where to start, hire a consultant, get someone who can look at these things with you and say, this is equitable or this isn't equitable. Here are my suggestions.
It's so interesting because I can sort of hear in my mind, I can hear the yeah, but that some people come with, right? So yeah, but our organization wants to hire the best. And what I'm hearing from you is, okay, but how are you defining the best? And the assumption that someone who checks these boxes is going to be the best is actually the flaw. That's the flawed thinking. So that's powerful. That's really powerful.
And let me also drop this on you, okay? So in interviewing, one of the things that I think is difficult for people to wrap their arms around is the fact that we'll say, okay, here's my ideal candidate. This person, I'll ask a question about, tell me a time where you overcame a challenge, at work, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever the question is that you ask, understanding that not everybody from every background is going to answer those questions the same way. So historically, we've looked for, answers that sort of fit within this, sort of white male business way of thinking, right? And it's, again, not right, wrong, or otherwise, it's just the way that it is because white men started all of the businesses, in our culture. That's just how it is. But if I'm, especially, when we're talking about more entry-level roles, maybe I've never had a job before, so I don't have that. But if I can tell you, I ran around taking care of, my 3 siblings while I also held down a job, while I also was going to school, if I can still answer your question in a way that may not look exactly the way that you're used to, getting the answer, that doesn't mean that I didn't answer your question.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes the language that we use, people will say, oh, well, if I'm interviewing, you should sit up straight and you should look me in the face and you should, all of these different rules. But culturally, not everyone does that. There are cultures where it's not considered polite to stare at someone while they're talking to you. As an example. So understanding that those cultural differences don't necessarily mean that that person isn't a good culture fit for your organization. They just may approach things in a different way because they come from a different background than you do.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's really powerful. I know one that I've experienced as a hiring manager is speaking about we versus I. And how, some individuals have a real discomfort with one way or the other. But definitely that there's a cultural, there's a gender-based component to that. There's a lot of different aspects to that where someone and you can probe for it, but they'll be saying we. And so, it's as a hiring manager, it's being able to ask, I'm really interested in knowing some specific actions that you were directly involved in, or, were there things that you took the lead on and that sort of thing, and trying to sort of maybe get at the competencies that you're looking for in a different way, because it can be hard to sort through. Are you seeing the skills that you need to see demonstrated, but not dismissing someone outright as a candidate because they're not in there going, I did this and I did that. And
yeah, because that's a very gendered, the we is a very gendered, very, race, ethnic. Not everybody does that, that was one of the ones that I had to overcome because I just don't naturally say I, right? I'm more of a we person. That's just how I am, but that doesn't mean that I can't be a strong individual contributor.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Many of my clients and the women that I speak to struggle to get ahead in leadership for many of the reasons we've just talked about, but also facing a lack of confidence, or having an inner critic that's sort of like that voice that's sitting on their shoulder going, who do you think you're kidding? That sort of thing. And, kind of battling them at every turn as they're trying to move up or get ahead. And I really see a lot of this these internal barriers as internalized bias, because I think we're socialized. I've used a terribly mixed metaphor sometimes, saying like we're all swimming in the same stew of whether it's gender or racialization or what it is, right? We like, it's just because you are one of a marginalized group doesn't mean you somehow have this perfect armor that keeps out all that socialization. And so, I'm interested to know, whether you've had that experience yourself of some of those internalized barriers, and maybe how you've dealt with them, if you've got some suggestions on that or thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So daily, daily I battle that. I hate the phrase imposter syndrome, but it's accurate. And I think that it's very common, right? Dealing with those inner barriers, it is so personal, and it is so different person to person. I will say, for me, some of the things that have really helped are surrounding myself with just positive with hype men, and that's a gendered term, but just hype people that are going to tell you that you're amazing and that you're awesome. Not to say that they're not going to call you on your, when you need to be called out, but people that are going to, hype you up more than they're going to hold you down. Who you surround yourself with, and that doesn't have to be, physically in your presence. It can also be the people, the places you go online, etc. Find yourself at least, one small group of people who are going to hype you up and be there cheering you on no matter what. That's a huge one for me. The other thing that works really well for me is just mantras, or again, consistently having that positive messaging. So aside from having a group of people, also following pages on social media, or at one point when I was just getting started, I would actually like print off from like Google Images these random positive sayings and stick them on my mirror in my bathroom. And I was literally reciting affirmations to myself in the mirror, and it felt completely ridiculous, because I'm sitting here talking to myself in the mirror, you are amazing, you are capable, right? All of these things. But it's one of those things where the more you say it to yourself, the more you hear it, the more comfortable you get with the idea, but then also eventually you start to believe it. If you just tell yourself those things every day, even if you don't believe it, somewhere along the line, you'll start to believe it. Right. And so those little things that you can do to sort of hype yourself up again, or get other people in your circle who are going to hype you up. And then the last thing is something that I do, completely ridiculous. Something that I do that I learned off of Grey's Anatomy, because I love that show. And so there's a scene where the character Amelia is getting ready to go in and do this really big surgery, and she's really uncomfortable. She's really unsure of herself, exactly what we're talking about. And she stands up straight in the Superman pose, chest out, head up, kind of a thing. And she's just standing there. And then the other character is like, what are you doing? And she's like, there's studies that show if you stand in the Superman pose, before you go in and do something, that it helps, boost your confidence. And so again, completely ridiculous. But if I have an interview that I'm getting ready to go into, or if there's even a difficult conversation that I know that I have to have, anything that I just feel like I need some extra motivation, I will, no joke, find somewhere to go stand and do the Superman pose. And it helps. And I don't know why, it just does.
Yeah.
So those are probably the main things that I would say. The long and short of the story is, you are more qualified than your head is telling you. You are more capable than your head is telling you. You have the ability to do the thing that you are trying to do. You just need to believe it.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. If we finish up with a question that I really enjoy, if you could go back and mentor your younger self at whatever point in your life, what support or advice would you give?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I see those questions pop up like on social media all the time, and I never have a good answer for it because I just don't know. I think probably the biggest thing would just be patient with yourself. Be patient with your journey. Just because you're not, at this level by the time you're 30 and by this level by the time you're 35, whatever the world is telling you that you should have by whatever age, doesn't mean that you're failing. It doesn't mean that you're never going to get there. It doesn't mean that you are incapable or that you're not good enough. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself grace. Keep working hard. You can do everything right and still fail, and that's okay. But you got to keep going on your journey.
Awesome. Thank you. Tai, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I so much appreciate it. I feel like there is a lot that we could have delved into, and in the interest of time, maybe we can make this a more regular occurrence and record more. But yeah, thank you.
I would love to.
Very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tai. And thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or anything that I can do to support you, please reach out. If you have questions for Tai as well, I'm sure just comment or send me a note, and I'm happy to pass them along. I'm sure she'd be happy to address them. Thanks so much. Bye.